Hello, welcome to another video in the series of tutorials dedicated to using the Muse headband in ERP research. This video is meant as a brief guide to setting up experimental tasks using the Muse-compatible peer software currently available on iPadOS. We'll start with a little bit of context by looking at a commonly used experimental paradigm known as the oddball task. And after that, based on a simple example, we'll go over the specifics of creating and customizing an oddball task using the peer app. While I will be focusing on the oddball, you should know that the peer app also lets you run various types of go-no-go experiments, and as far as the setup process is concerned, they should be fairly easy to set up once you know your way around the app. So without further ado, let's get started and take a closer look at the oddball task. So what is the oddball paradigm? Simply put, it is a type of experimental design where participants are presented with a sequence of stimuli in which one type of stimulus stands out and occurs infrequently compared to the other. The stimulus is known as the target or the oddball, while the frequent stimulus is referred to as the standard. In the context of ERP research, the purpose of this task is to measure participants' average neuroelectric response to target and standard stimuli, and look at the difference between them to isolate participants' specific ERP response to deviance. If this description sounds kind of fuzzy, well, that's because it is, on purpose. There really isn't a strict set of rules that define some kind of gold standard for the oddball paradigm. It's actually best thought of as a family of tasks that can be presented in different modalities with completely different kinds of instructions depending on your specific experimental needs. For starters, oddball tasks can be passive or active. Passive oddball requires no response from the participant, and they're actually often explicitly told to ignore the stimuli. On the other hand, active oddball requires some kind of response. In one response variant, the participant will respond just to the targets, whereas in the multiple response oddball, they will have to provide different responses to targets and standards. In all of these active paradigms, the responses can be either overt or covert. Overt responses include all kinds of button presses, screen taps, or just verbal responses, which need to be provided on a trial-by-trial basis. Covert responses, on the other hand, can look something like counting the stimuli silently in one's mind. The participant may still be asked to report that number at the end of the task, but the main difference here is that no behavioral response will be required trial to trial. What's more, oddball tasks can be visual, auditory, or even tactile, and the specific properties of the stimuli will mostly depend on your experimental question. So as you can see, there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to designing your oddball task, and the end result will very much depend on your questions as well as the software that you're going to be using. So if you're choosing to rely on something like the peer app for running your study, you will be limited to the options it provides. Fortunately though, most variations of oddball are actually available in peer, as we'll see later in this tutorial. Alright, so with all of this in mind, let's now work through a specific example. Let's imagine that I want to know how target probability affects participants' ERP response to deviance. By target probability, I simply mean how often the target stimulus appears in each block of trials. I've looked at the past literature and based on that decided to compare 10% target probability with 30%. And based on these existing studies, I also decided to run this as an auditory oddball with short beeps as the stimuli. I want the higher pitched beeps to act as targets and the lower pitched beeps as standards. Finally, I want participants to pay attention to the beeps, keeping a mental count of the targets without physically responding to any of them. So in other words, what I want to set up is an active auditory oddball with a covert response just to the target stimuli. Okay, so we'll now move on to the practical half of this tutorial, in which I'll demonstrate how to set up the example auditory oddball tasks that we looked at in the introduction. Mind you, similar principles will apply to the go-no-go, as well as other variations of oddball, with just minor differences relating to the task structure. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll know enough about the Peer app to be able to set up your very own ERP experiment, be it oddball or go-no-go. So in our example, we want participants to complete the oddball task under two different conditions. First, with target probability of 10, and second, with target probability of 30. In the context of Peer, it actually helps to rephrase this a little bit and say that we want participants to complete two slightly different tasks that are actually separate from each other. One of them will have the target probability of 10 and the other of 30, but in most other respects, they will be identical. So what we're going to do is create two separate tasks for this experiment, and we'll begin by making the 10% task. To get started, open the Peer app, and from the main menu, select Edit Menu. That will open up the Studies menu, where under Add New Study tab, you'll want to select Oddball, which will add a new Oddball study option to My Studies tab. Click on that and you'll be taken to the settings page where you'll be able to customize the task to suit your specific needs. First, you'll change the task name. Since in this example I'm setting up an active auditory oddball with 10% target probability, I will simply call it oddball odd active 10, just so I know exactly what kind of task it is. Next, you'll select the type of oddball task that you want to administer. As mentioned in the introduction, oddball tasks come in all kinds of different variations, and Peer actually offers a bunch of them to choose from. So to view these, click on Variation and you'll immediately see 6 different options, half of which will be visual and half auditory. I should emphasize that the naming of some of these can be a little bit confusing. So in the literature, the difference between active and passive oddball is essentially in the instructions given to participant. So what we call passive oddball is simply a scenario where the stimuli are presented to the participant who is explicitly told to ignore them. Now in Peer, the passive oddball can be used as true passive oddball only if you don't show the participant the on-screen instructions. The reason I'm saying that is because the instructions in these are actually set up for an active oddball with counting response. That is to say, the instructions will ask the participant to pay attention to the stimuli and keep a mental count of the targets. There will also be a pop-up window at the end of every block, prompting the participant to enter the number of targets. So in that sense, the so-called passive oddball option in Peer can be used both as passive and active oddball. Coming back to the present example, since I want to administer an active auditory oddball where participants will count the target sounds without providing physical response to individual stimuli, I will go ahead and select Passive Audio Oddball and click Done to return to the settings page. We can now move on to specifying the structure of the task. Under Passive Audio Oddball tab, you'll be able to adjust the number of blocks and the number of trials in each and every block. Let's say that for the example study, I want to make sure that participants hear 30 target sounds per condition. So for the 10% task, I'll go ahead and create 3 blocks of 100 trials each. That way, each block will contain 10 targets, and 3 blocks will give me 30 targets in total. I will keep the default option for the background color, which is black, and move on to the Scenes tab. On the first page here, you'll be able to edit anything relating to the fixation cross. The first option will allow you to edit the fixation period, which is the amount of time for which the fixation cross will be presented on the screen before stimulus onset. This is the first of the 2 parameters which will control the interstimulus period, or the amount of time between the offset of one stimulus and the onset of the next. We'll look at the second parameter in a bit, but for now I'll just set this to 500 milliseconds and move on. I should add that when it comes to visual experiments, this will be the only time when the cross will be present on the screen. In auditory experiments though, the fixation cross will actually stay on screen all throughout the task, so all the setting is going to do is change the duration of the interstimulus period. I know this can be a bit confusing when you're just starting out, so just keep that in mind when you're changing this setting. The so-called fixation jitter below controls the amount of time by which the fixation period is allowed to vary. By default, this is set to 200 milliseconds, which means that on every trial, the fixation period will be slightly different, and instead of being 500 milliseconds exactly, it will be a random amount of time between 300 milliseconds and 700 milliseconds. Unless your specific experiment calls for this, I would advise turning this all the way down to 0, just to make sure that all trials are the same length. The other two options will allow you to edit the appearance of the cross itself. Most of the time, the specifics won't matter too much, so as long as you make sure that the cross is easy to see and that it's the same across all your tasks and conditions, you can edit it however you like. I'll make mine 15 millimeters big and keep it yellow, although you can change it to any other color. Moving on to the second page, here you'll be able to customize your stimuli, so this screen is super important. First off, you'll want to set the oddball probability, which tells you how often the target stimulus will appear within each block. Unfortunately though, the probability setting does not work quite as intended. You would think that if we wanted to set up a task with 10% target probability, we would move the slider to 10. But unfortunately, what happens when we do that is the resulting task actually has 9% target probability. So if our block consists of 100 trials, target stimulus will appear only 9 times as opposed to 10. This is a bug, it should not be happening, and my guess is that it's caused by how the app handles numbers internally. So what you need to do instead is play with the settings and set the probability to a slightly larger percentage than you actually need, and then run yourself through the task to make sure that you get the correct number of targets per block. I've experimented with this before, and I found that to get 10% target probability in a 100 trial block, I actually need to set the slider to 11%. I should emphasize that just adding 1 to whatever your actual probability is does not always have the desired effect, so it's really important that you test this for yourself and figure out how much you need to increase this by. Next, we'll move on to customizing the properties of the stimuli. In auditory tasks, Peer allows you to manipulate the pitch of your sounds. So, for example, you can set your target to be higher than the standard stimulus. The specific parameters will depend on your experiment, so especially if you're trying to replicate some previous studies, it helps to look at the methods in that literature to see what parameters have been used in the past. In this example, I will set my target to 1500 Hz and my standard to 1000, so that the target is noticeably higher in pitch. These are pretty standard values, and you'll actually find them in a lot of early classic literature on the P300. Next, you'll set stimulus duration, a parameter that controls how long each sound will play for. This will apply both to the target and the standard stimuli. Again, you'll have to make a decision about that based on the literature that you're working with, and for this example, I'll set mine to 100 milliseconds. The last option in this tab is stimulus period, which is the second of the two parameters that define interstimulus period. This setting controls the amount of time between the offset of the stimulus and the onset of the fixation period. The two periods add up, meaning that if our fixation period is set to 500 milliseconds and we also set the stimulus period to 500, the total interstimulus period will be 1000 milliseconds or 1 second. Scrolling down under the tab called Other, you'll see a few other settings that you should be aware of. First off, you'd want to enable Record Baseline EEG. What this will do is introduce a section right before the start of your task where the participant will be asked to close their eyes, relax, and sit quietly for a few seconds until they hear a ringing sound. During those few seconds, the Muse will record what is known as the baseline, which is basically a chunk of clean brain activity uncontaminated by eye blinks or other artifacts. The app will use this data during the analysis stage to better separate the changes in brain activity that are triggered by the stimuli from the background noise and artifacts. You can keep this fairly short, around 15 seconds should be enough, but by default this is set to 30 seconds. Muse quality calibration controls the amount of time that the app spends on the signal quality screen. Essentially, it sets the duration for which the Muse has to pick up good quality signal before it lets you start the task. By default, this is set to 5 seconds, and unfortunately, it seems to be the minimum. So even if you lower that number, let's say to 2 seconds, the app will still take 5 seconds to calibrate. So you can make it longer, but you can't speed it up. Next, we have monitor artifacts. This option will enable messages that will tell you about the nature of artifacts encountered during a block of trials. The messages will only appear when the app detects some real problem with the data, such as poor connection on some electrodes or indeed lots of eye blinks. And sometimes that will be useful since it will actually indicate to you as a researcher what adjustments you could make to improve your data quality. For that reason, I recommend keeping this on. Moving on to start and end delta stimulus options. I have to admit, I have no idea what these are supposed to do. I've tried manipulating them and they seem to make no difference whatsoever to how the task runs or how Peer analyzes the data afterwards, so I'd advise just leaving them alone. Next option is allow cancel. This is pretty straightforward, so if enabled, the task could easily be cancelled at any point during the recording, with the data collected being saved as a separate entry in the app. This is generally useful, and if you're going to be supervising the participant all throughout the experiment, I would recommend having this on. What can happen though is that the participant might accidentally press cancel in the middle of the experiment, and you're going to have to either restart the task and lose time, or potentially be left with not enough data for the app to compute your ERP parameters. In my example experiment, I'll keep this enabled and make sure that I watch over the participant during the task. Moving on, the eye blink marker sync is in theory a very useful function since it's meant to improve the recognition and removal of eye blink artifacts during analysis. So what it's meant to do is turn the iPad frontal camera on before recording, ask participant to blink, and then synchronize the video and the EEG data to basically learn what an eye blink looks like in a particular participant. In practice though, it doesn't work that well and can be extremely frustrating, especially if the participant's face isn't well lit. Most of the time, it struggles to recognize the eye blink in the video and makes you lose a lot of time because you can't skip this screen. So I would recommend keeping this option off for the actual experiment. Lower down, you'll see a show progress option. When this is enabled, the app will display a progress tracker at the bottom of the task screen that will indicate how far along the participant is in the task. If you're planning on letting the participant see the screen, I would recommend turning this off, since this will just introduce an unnecessary distraction. Since in my example, I want the participant to look at the iPad screen, I will turn this option off. And same goes for the show EEG quality option. If enabled, it will add a signal quality tracker at the bottom of the task screen that will just be a miniature version of the quality check that you get at the start of the task. This can be useful, particularly when you're just learning to use the device or when you're troubleshooting, but at the end of the day, it still introduces a distraction to the screen, so I would keep it off for actual testing if participants will be looking at the screen. When you're happy with your settings, click Done and then Done again, and your task will be ready to use under New Recording tab. Keep in mind that you can always go back and make changes to your task by clicking on Edit menu and selecting the task that you want to modify. Alright, so now that we've set up the 10% target probability version of the task, we need to make its 30% counterpart. Since we want to keep everything apart from target probability the same, there's no point in us setting up another task from scratch. What we're going to do instead is duplicate the study that we just created and change a couple of settings. So we'll start by clicking Edit menu and selecting Duplicate Study. This will open up a list of studies that are currently available in the app, and we're just going to go ahead and select our 10% oddball. As you can see, that will create a copy of the task right below the original file, which we can now edit however we want. So let's click on it, and the first thing we're going to do here is change the task name to 30%. And after that, we can navigate to the stimulus panel under Scenes and edit the oddball probability. Again, due to some kind of internal bug, 30 won't actually work here, so I'll try 31 instead. And one last thing we'll need to change will be the number of blocks. We want to keep the number of oddball stimuli consistent across conditions, so as in our 10% version, we want participants to hear 30 target sounds in total. With 30% probability, that will actually be achieved in a single block of 100. So I'll lower the block number to 1 and save our changes by clicking Done. And with that, our example task is complete and ready to be used in a study. It goes without saying that when you're setting up your own tasks, you should always run yourself through them to make sure that everything's working as expected before you start testing participants. And that brings us to the end of this tutorial. I hope you found it useful, and I wish you best of luck in setting up your very own mobile ERP studies. Thanks for watching.